Today, the Russian investigation into the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack continues to move forward at lightning speed, with meetings addressed by President Putin, more suspects brought before the Basmani court, reports of arrests in Turkey, which appear to be in some way connected to this event, and statements by various other Russian officials. There's also been a cascade of comment about these events, these latest events, in the Western media. And I'm going to say that so far as the British media specifically is concerned, there's been a whole series of editorials in all of the major broadsheet newspapers, and they are all essentially the same. They are virtually interchangeable with each other. The theme that they say is that this was a terrible terrorist attack. There is enormous amount of regret for the people of Russia who were killed in this attack, that the attack was carried out exclusively by ISIS, with no one else involved, and that it is outrageous or appalling or some such word that President Putin is supposedly seeking to misdirect away from his own responsibility by saying that Ukraine might be responsible. There's been a whole set of these articles in the British media, in what is supposed to be competing newspapers. When I say articles, I correct that, editorials in the British media, all of which, without exception, say essentially that very same thing. Now, they come along with all sorts of other claims. Claims, for example, that there is no evidence at all that the attack was carried out by anyone other than ISIS, that there is no evidence at all linking Ukraine to this attack. And, well, there have been other comments as well. There was a very astonishing one by the Foreign Ministry spokesman of the European Union, or rather the Foreign Affairs spokesman of the European Union, saying that Russia had been the target of many terrorist attacks, but none of them had been investigated properly. A comment, by the way, which I found astonishing. Before I just proceed to discuss the state of the Russian investigation, I want to say something about all of this sort of commentary. Firstly, it is simply not true to say that there is no evidence at all that might link Ukraine to this attack. Evidence, and I really want to emphasize this, is not the same as proof. A point many people tend to forget and overlook. The fact that there might be evidence in pointing in one particular direction does not prove a case. It doesn't mean that the person in whose direction the evidence points is actually guilty of anything. But in this case, we do have evidence, and it does concern Ukraine, and that evidence which the Western media, and most specifically the British media, with which I am most familiar, doesn't want to wrestle, in fact, it barely mentions it, is the evidence that the 4 gunmen were trying to escape towards the Ukrainian border, presumably with the intention of crossing that border. If they did intend to cross the border into Ukraine, then Ukraine is connected to this event. It may be that the Ukrainian authorities themselves had no knowledge or involvement in this affair, but it would suggest that someone in Ukraine is involved in some form, that these 4 gunmen assumed that if they could cross the border into Ukraine, they would be safe, that Ukraine, in other words, provides some kind of sanctuary, and it's plausible that they expected to get some help from someone who is there. That person may have no connection with the Ukrainian authorities, no connection with the Ukrainian government, might not even be Ukrainian. They might be someone from one of the Central Asian or Middle Eastern states who is currently in Ukraine. But the point is, and this is the only point I'm making, someone presumably in Ukraine was waiting to receive these people. Now, that brings me back to this point. Evidence, therefore, does exist. I mean, it may not be evidence that leads anywhere in the end, but to say that there is no evidence connecting Ukraine to this affair as of the time of making of this program is simply wrong. The other thing is that the media commentary has spent an enormous amount of time, an astonishing amount of time, discussing the warning that the United States and Britain gave on the 7th of March. And there's been much comment and discussion about how the Russians disregarded, ignored this warning, and as a result, bear some responsibility, with President Putin specifically bearing responsibility for the terrorist attack on Crocus City Hall on the 22nd of March. Well, I decided to track down and find what that warning on the 7th of March actually said. And I found this report in Moscow Times, a newspaper published not in Moscow, by the way, but in the Netherlands, as I understand it, which is published in English and which is intensely, extremely antagonistic to President Putin and his government. Anyway, this is a report in Moscow Times dated the 8th of March. And it says that the US Embassy in Moscow said Thursday that it was aware of imminent plans by extremists to target public gatherings in the Russian capital over the next 2 days. And then we have the text of the warning itself. The embassy is monitoring reports that extremists have imminent plans to target large gatherings in Moscow, to include concerts. US citizens should be advised to avoid large gatherings over the next 48 hours. Now, that is actually quite a vague report in most respects, except one, which is that, of course, it refers to concerts, and the attack, which took place on the 22nd of March, was in fact an attack on a rock concert. But note that it doesn't mention ISIS, Islamist terrorists, or anything of that kind. It speaks only of extremists, and most important of all, it covers a period of just 48 hours. Now, the Americans say that they passed on this warning to the Russian authorities as well. The Russian authorities say that they did not receive any useful warning, any warning from the United States. I think there is actually a way round these contradictory claims, and I think we're getting a lot of information which now basically confirms what I said, which is that the Americans and the British, but particularly the Americans, did pass on this specific warning to the Russian authorities, as they say, but it is the same warning. The warning that they passed on to the Russian authorities was the same as the one that they made publicly. In other words, a vague warning that extremists had imminent plans to target large gatherings in Moscow, including concerts, and no mention who these extremists were, whether they were Islamists, whether they were ISIS, and of course a warning that covered a period of just 48 hours. Now, I'm seeing reports that there was a big concert, either on the 8th or 9th of March at Crocus City Hall. And apparently the Russian authorities, perhaps acting on this warning, ensured that there was very heavy protection provided at this concert, which might possibly have deterred any planned terrorist attack. Notice that this warning covers a period of just 48 hours. In other words, up to the 10th of March. The attack took place on the 22nd of March, 12 days after the 48-hour period, which this warning covers. And the United States and the British provided no further warnings during that 12-day period. There was no attack during the 48-hour period of the warning, and after the end of that 48-hour period, any US or British citizens in Moscow might have concluded that the danger had passed and they were free to attend concerts again. In other words, this warning is undoubtedly important. It does suggest that the United States was being provided with information and intelligence which forewarned of an attack on Moscow. But it was not the kind of warning that might have led the Russians to be on guard for an attack on the 22nd of March. It was very vague, and it covered a 48-hour period much earlier in the month, which by that point had already passed. Now, again, this is not a point that I have noticed the Western media say. One might perhaps say that the Russians should nonetheless have been on their guard after this warning was given. But as I said, the terms of the warning, the actual very limited and rather vague nature of the warning itself, is not really discussed, at least not in any detail. How long were the Russians supposed to maintain massive precautions in Moscow beyond that 48-hour period? Did the West provide them with any further information to extend that time? It seems not. The Russians probably would have decided that one can't keep the whole city under lock and key indefinitely, and at some point, if they were given no further reason to think that an attack was coming, they would have relaxed their guard. So, to repeat, would American and British citizens in Moscow. Perhaps the Russians are at fault for doing that. Perhaps their own intelligence services were not working quite as efficiently as they ought to have been. But already we see that this is a more nuanced and complicated story than the one we have been receiving from the media. Then there's the last point, the media in the West. But then there's the last point about, that it's absolutely outrageous, completely wrong, shocking, terrible of Putin to in any way implicate Ukraine in this matter. Now, you may feel that the evidence of Ukrainian involvement is very threadbare. But as I've said already, there is some evidence. And, of course, this attack has happened in the context of a conflict, an armed conflict, between Russia and Ukraine. And not only has it happened in the context of an armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but it has happened in the context of an armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, in which Ukraine has carried out various attacks against civilian targets within Russia itself. And by the way, on that subject, no less a person than the head of the SBU, Ukraine's internal security agency, has now come out and publicly admitted that yes, it is indeed true, Ukraine has actually carried out these attacks, the attacks on people like Daria Dugina, Tatarsky, and others. And, well, given that this is so, and given that there were also attacks throughout March by the Ukrainian military on various border villages, and given that there's been shelling by Ukraine of various Russian border towns, it is not entirely surprising that the Russian authorities might, in connection with any warning that they are given of attacks by extremists in Moscow, assume a Ukrainian connection, or after such an attack has indeed taken place, might, when the individuals, the perpetrators, are trying to escape towards Ukraine, say to themselves that a Ukrainian connection is probably there. Now, you may think that that is wrong. You may say that it's completely inappropriate for the Russians to think in that way, but it is not surprising, and in light of all that has happened, I think it is a very big stretch indeed to simply say that it is outrageous. Now, I mention all of this because Putin, of course, has just made precisely those very points. And he did that over the course of a meeting yesterday, which took place in the Kremlin, where he called a video conference with the heads of the government, regions, security services, and law enforcement agencies on measures being taken after the attack on the Crocus City Hall concert venue. And the Kremlin has provided a photographic study which provides us with some clue of some of the people who participated. The key speakers, if I may say, the ones who the Kremlin has provided a readout for what they said, the key speaker was Alexander Vostrikhin, the chairman of the investigative committee, who I think is the lead investigator in the case. But others who also spoke include probably the FSB chief, Alexander Bortnikov, and the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, and the commander of the Rosgvardia organization, Viktor Zalotov. We know that Sobyanin spoke because the Kremlin has provided a readout of what he said. We don't know that Sobyanin and Bortnikov and Zalotov spoke because we've not been provided with readouts. But I have to say, I think it is very likely. Others who were there include people like Interior Minister Kolokoltsev, and there were probably others who spoke as well. Anyway, let's focus on what Putin said at this meeting, because he said some interesting things, and I'm going to read here the Kremlin transcript in focusing on those particular words. Now, after expressing his own dismay and grief at what had happened and his solidarity with the people who have suffered loss as a result of this terrorist attack, Putin then went on to say this: "We know that the crime was perpetrated by radical Islamists. The Islamic world itself has been fighting this ideology for centuries. But we are also seeing how the United States is using different channels to try and convince its satellites," those are the European countries, by the way, "and other countries of the world that, according to its intelligence, there is supposedly no sign of Kiev's involvement in the Moscow terrorist attack, that the deadly terrorist attack was perpetrated by followers of Islam, members of ISIS, an organization banned in Russia." And then, of course, he says, "We know that the crime was perpetrated by radical Islamists. We know whose hands were used to commit this atrocity." In other words, it was radical Islamists. But then he goes on to say, we want to know who ordered it. We need to obtain answers to a number of questions in the course of joint work of our security services and law enforcement agencies. And then he asks a whole series of questions. For example, do radical and even terrorist Islamist organizations truly have an interest in launching attacks on Russia now that it supports a fair resolution of the escalated conflict in the Middle East? I would answer that question as yes, by the way. I think that an organization like ISIS is not going to be impressed by what Russia is doing in a place like the UN Security Council. Just saying. He then goes on to say, how do radical Islamists who present themselves as devout Muslims and follow the so-called pure Islam justify committing atrocities and serious crimes during the holy month of Ramadan, which is sacred to all Muslims? Again, I can answer that question for him. I don't think they care, frankly, about particular days in the calendar. Most Muslims I know take Ramadan very seriously. The kind of people we're talking about probably see the perpetration of an act of violence like this as a way of celebrating and commemorating Ramadan. Just saying. But then he goes on to say this. Then he went on to say this. We will need to answer these and other more specific and professional questions in order to carry out an objective investigation into the crime committed in Moscow. This leads to the next question. Who stands to benefit from it? This act of violence is just one in a series of attempts by those who've been fighting against our country since 2014, using the neo-Nazi Kiev regime as a pawn. Now, that is a most interesting statement, because what Putin is saying here is not that it was the Ukrainians who benefited from this affair or who were ultimately behind it. The people who were ultimately behind it, he is hinting very heavily, was the United States and Britain. Now, some of us may think that that is very unlikely. Some of us may think that is straightforwardly paranoid. I know there are going to be people who will say that. Of course, there has been a history of the United States and Britain backing Islamist groups. They did so, of course, in Afghanistan, in the war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. They did so in Syria during the war to try to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad, who has, by the way, telephoned President Putin to express his sympathy and solidarity. So one can't say that the United States and Britain have never been involved in these sort of things. Putin provides no evidence that they were involved in this affair, but I think people who focus on the fingers Putin is pointing towards Ukraine overlook the fact that in his comments he was pointing fingers at the Western powers as well. Anyway, Um, the countries, in other words, that use the neo-Nazi Kiev regime as a pawn, just to cite his words. Note, by the way, that once again, he's careful to refer to the Ukrainian government as the neo-Nazi Kiev regime. I've already, in previous videos, discussed the implications of what that means. And then he goes on to say this: as for the neo-Nazis, it is widely known that they have never hesitated to employ the most repugnant and inhumane methods to achieve their aims. And he then talks about the kind of things that Ukraine has been doing. He says this becomes even more apparent today, as their much touted counteroffensive has failed completely, as acknowledged by everyone, and is no longer disputed. The Russian forces are maintaining the initiative along the entire front line, whilst the enemy's efforts to stabilize the front have been unsuccessful. Hence, the attempts to infiltrate our border territories, establish a presence there, the artillery attacks, including the use of multiple rocket launchers on peaceful residential areas and civilian infrastructure facilities, such as power grids, and attempts to launch missiles at the Crimean Bridge and the Crimean Peninsula itself. These bloody acts of intimidation, like the terrorist attack in Moscow, fit logically into this sequence. Their goal, as I mentioned, is to sow panic in our society, whilst demonstrating to their own people that not all hope is lost for the Kiev regime. All they need to do is follow the orders of their Western patrons, fight until the last Ukrainian, obey Washington's commands, endorse the new mobilization law, and form something resembling a new version of, and then he refers to a government-backed German youth movement active in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. I'm not going to name it. He then goes on to say they do this to comply with all of this. They will seek new weapons and additional funds, much of which will likely be embezzled and, as is customary in Ukraine today, put into their own pockets. Now, I should say, I personally feel that Putin acted in some ways improperly in making these comments. He was meeting the investigators into the Crocus City Hall affair. People like Tsirkon, who provided a very detailed and factual report directly after Putin's words. To me, and I'm sure to many others, these words look like a steer. Putin basically telling Tsirkon, Zolotov, Botnikov, and the others, look, we all know who's really responsible for this. Yes, ISIS was involved. Yes, Islamists were involved. But of course, behind it was the hands of the West. Probably the Ukrainians acted in some way. You must now not only track down those who carried out the attack themselves, you must go and find that additional evidence that will prove that which we all know to be true. Now, I don't personally think that a person in authority should be talking like that to the investigators in charge of a case. I would say that about the President of the United States. I have said that in the past about the Prime Minister of Great Britain. I remember when Theresa May got up in the House of Commons and made it absolutely clear, as far as she was concerned, that the Russians were responsible for the attack on the Skripals. This was the investigation, had only just begun. The police investigation had only just begun. And I said then that that seemed to me completely inappropriate. It was Theresa May telling the British police what the outcome of their investigation should be. And here we have Putin, in effect, doing something like the same thing. Having said that, he is making some valid points. Going back to what I said before, it is the case that the Ukrainians have carried out attacks, various attacks within Russia. They have carried out murders there. They did plant bombs on the Crimean Bridge. They have bombed and shelled Russian border villages and Russian towns. Again, none of this is ever acknowledged in Western media commentary of this affair. Now, since Putin spoke, other Russian officials have also been speaking. Dmitry Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, the person who is in overall charge of Russia's intelligence community, he's come out and has straightforwardly said, he was asked a question, he replied, it was asked who was ultimately responsible for this attack, and he said, apparently the words he uses, of course, Ukraine. And Alexander Bortnikov, the director of the FSB, he's given a very extensive interview. He's basically echoed a lot of what Putin has been saying. He also says that the British and the Americans, the Western powers, are in some way involved in this event, and almost certainly Ukraine is involved also. And you can see this is the comment about this, which is provided, which has been reported by TASS. We believe that this is true. We are now talking about the factual information we have. These are Bortnikov's words. This is general information, but they have a long record of this sort when asked whether the US, Britain, and Ukraine were behind the terrorist attack. So he's answered in response to a question. He goes on to say that he believes, Bortnikov believes, that Ukraine has been trying to prove it is capable enough. What is it expected to do to demonstrate its capability? It is expected to carry out sabotage and terrorist attacks in the rear. That is what both the chiefs of Ukraine's special services and the British special services are aiming at. US special services have repeatedly mentioned this too. Now, what he's basically saying, and he might be right, all of this may be true, is not that the British and the Americans were directly involved in the Crocus City Hall attack. He's not saying that. But he says that they have responsibility for it because they've basically encouraged the Ukrainians to carry out these kind of attacks inside Russia, and the Ukrainians have carried out many attacks inside Russia, and there's no logical reason to think that they were not also involved in this one, especially given that we have the evidence of the terrorists themselves trying to flee to Ukraine. Well, I suspect that this is going to be a particularly messy affair. But over the next couple of days, we're going to get an awful lot more news. It's, as I said already, it seems that the entire network of this terrorist group has been captured. There are reports last night, in fact, they weren't just reports, they are confirmed reports, that around 40 people in Istanbul have been arrested by the Turkish authorities, apparently following a tip-off by the Russians. It seems that 2 of the gunmen who carried out the attack on the Crocus City Hall were present in Turkey, and the assumption is that they will have had contacts and perhaps even received some level of training there. One way or the other, the Russians will be able to put together all the pieces in this case. They might jump to conclusions that go beyond the facts. I would say that I, speaking for myself, as someone involved in investigations in the past, not as an investigator, I should say, I'm concerned by some of these comments that senior Russian officials are making. But, to say it again, these comments are not taken out of the air. They're not, it seems to me, an exercise in trying to divert attention or to lead us onto the wrong path or to throw responsibility for one's own transgressions onto someone else. They are the comments of senior people who probably believe that what they are saying is true and who are extremely angry. And it is that anger that people should be taking into account in the West now. Now, that brings me now to the actual events in Ukraine itself over the last 24 hours. Now, yesterday I discussed this missile attack on Kiev. I said that it looked as if the Russians had been targeting the Patriot missile batteries at the Zheleny airfield, and this has basically been confirmed. There are reports that 2 Patriot missiles systems have been destroyed. There were also reports yesterday that the Russians were hunting facilities connected to the SBU across Kiev. And one building in particular was destroyed, probably with many people inside killed. And it seems that this was a building of the SBU, Ukraine's internal security agency. And I cannot help but think that this is probably connected with the Crocus City Hall attacks. I don't know what information the Russians have, but I'm starting to get the sense that they not only think that there is a Ukrainian connection to this attack, the attack on Crocus City Hall, but that they believe that the agency that carried out the attack, or which facilitated the attack, was not Budanov's military intelligence, but the SBU, a much bigger agency than Budanov's military intelligence, and perhaps one that is becoming frustrated that Budanov is getting all the attention, and which perhaps, just possibly, might therefore have got itself involved in all sorts of things which perhaps got out of control and have led to what happened in Moscow on the 22nd of March. Now that is, as I said, speculative, but it's not impossible. Anyway, they've attacked facilities of the SBU, and sure enough, we've had this defiant statement from an SBU official, the director of the SBU, today, coming out and saying, yes, we have done all these terrible things in Russia, and you know what? Despite the attacks on us, we're going to do them again. Now, when I discussed these attacks yesterday, I speculated that the Russians might have carried out these attacks with Tsirkon hypersonic missiles. Now, when I said that in my video, I said that purely as a guess on my own part. In the hours that followed, a cascade of reports began to appear that hypersonic missiles, Tsirkon hypersonic cruise missiles, were indeed used in this attack. And we've had a very interesting report from the Russian Defense Ministry. And it reads about this attack, and it reads as follows. And I should say that it came out rather late in the day, I suspect that there's been an awful lot of care in the way in which this particular report has been phrased. It says this: over the past 24 hours, the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered a grouped strike by long-range, sea-based and ground-based precision weaponry and unmanned aerial vehicles at decision-making centers, Ukrainian Security Service, that's SBU, objects, defense industry enterprises, as well as deployment areas of Ukrainian nationalist forces and foreign mercenaries. All the targets have been engaged. The goal of the strike has been achieved. Notice that this doesn't specify that the attack was on Kiev, and it doesn't mention the widely reported and almost certainly correct fact that 2 Patriot missile systems were also destroyed. Nor does it mention the fact that the missiles that were used, or at least some of the missiles that were used, were Tsirkon hypersonic cruise missiles. They do say that some of these missiles were sea-based, and the Tsirkon is launched primarily from warships. It was designed to be launched by warships, and some of the ships in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, I think, could be converted to launching Tsirkon missiles. The Admiral Makarov class frigates probably could do that, though we've had no reports to date that they were in fact used in that way. Other warships that probably have the capability to launch Tsirkon missiles from the Black Sea are the various Kilo-class submarines that are also operated by the Black Sea Fleet. Now, there are claims. Dima at the Military Summary Channel discussed them at length in a recent video, that these Tsirkon missiles were launched from the Black Sea by Russian warships, perhaps submarines, and that they flew the 700-kilometer distance from the Black Sea to Kiev in 6 minutes, which gives us some idea of the astonishing speed and precision of these missiles. And that doubtless explains the suddenness of this attack and the fact that the Ukrainians had no warnings, no particular warning of it. I'm going to make a guess. 1 missile struck the SBU building. 2 missiles were used against the Patriots. That explains the 3 explosions that witnesses reported hearing within seconds of the alarm, of the air raid alarm being given across Kiev. This looks like it was a devastating strike. And allegedly, the Ukrainians have in fact located debris from what reportedly is at least one of these Tsirkon missiles. Now, it does look as if other missiles also struck targets in and around Kiev, and we're told that as well as the decision-making centers and Ukrainian security service objects, defense industry exercises, enterprises, and deployment areas of Ukrainian nationalist formations and foreign mercenaries were also attacked. So a very devastating attack on Kiev overall, one which appears to have depleted its air defense system. Probably the Tsirkons knocked out the Patriot systems. There was the attack also on the SBU building, done at great speed so as to prevent the officials in that building who the Russians wanted to kill or wound, finding the time to escape and go to shelters. And once that Tsirkon strike was completed, the drones and the more conventional missiles also started to appear. And there's been much discussion and report about this. It looks as if there are still some air defences operating over Kiev, though one senses that the air defences over Kiev are now becoming severely depleted. Now, Dima at the Military Summary Channel believes that the attack on the SBU building and facilities in Kiev was a retaliation for the Crocus City Hall attack. Perhaps it was. We don't know this for a fact. If it was, more is coming. More is coming if the Russians have indeed concluded that there was some kind of Ukrainian involvement in the City Hall attack. And certain other comments by Bortnikov tell us the same thing, that apparently Bortnikov, the FSB director, has also said that the Russians are only starting now in taking the action that they intend to take to punish and eliminate those who were responsible for the attack on Crocus City Hall. So, a lot going on, and investigation that is taking place at lightning speed. As I've said in my previous programs, I've never known an investigation following an incident, a terrorist incident involving Islamist terrorists, proceed at this sort of speed, with all of the perpetrators captured, the entire network that was supporting them captured, others connected to them arrested in Istanbul. It looks actually as if ISIS, at least, has suffered a devastating blow as a result of this investigation. A point which, again, I've not seen anyone make, but it seems that many of their operatives in both Moscow and Istanbul have now been rounded up. And of course, the more people are arrested, the more people are detained, the more people are questioned, the more interrogations take place, the more information is assembled, the further the investigation will go, and the deeper it will go, and, well, we will see where this leads. Anyway, let's move on, because, of course, the attack on Kiev, devastating as it was, is not the only event that has taken place in the last 24 hours. The Russians have also carried out, over the last 24 hours, a massive combined drone, missile and bomb strike on Kharkiv. Kharkiv has been severely pounded by the Russians over the last couple of weeks. A couple of days ago, in one of the big Russian missile strikes, Kharkiv's entire energy system was basically knocked out. The city was left without electric power. Attempts to try to get the power system in Kharkiv working again have taken place. The Russians have now struck once more. The power system, again, apparently is off. The city is without power. Devastating for the civilians who are still there, but also, in a sense, a demonstration of power. And a number of people have correctly pointed out that it seems as if there was no anti-missile defences, air defences operating around Kharkiv at all. And the same is true of other attacks that have taken place in other places. The Russians launched a major Uranium-2 drone strike on Odessa. I think Odessa has perhaps suffered more strikes and attacks by the Russians than any other city in Ukraine since the start of the special military operation. The Russians come after Odessa month after month, week after year, week after week, and this has been going on for years. But anyway, more devastating strikes on Odessa, major strikes on Dnipro, and on Zaporozhye as well. And I wonder whether this is going to be the continued pattern from now on, whether the Russians are now settling into a situation where they feel able to conduct these strikes on a daily basis. This has not been true at previous stages of the war. If it is true now, then that suggests a very, very large stockpile of missiles has been built up indeed. But anyway, even as that continues, more news from the battlefronts. As I said, in aggregate, still negative, very negative for Ukraine. Now, there were lots of reports yesterday about further Russian advances in the Avdiivka area. And this morning, there are reports that the Russians have broken through Ukrainian defenses in Berdychi, one of the three villages, Berdychi, Orlovka, Tonenka, which had become the latest Ukrainian defense line west of Avdiivka. It seems as if Berdychi is now perhaps hours, perhaps days away from falling. We'll see. Anyway, the Russians have made a major advance, apparently, in Berdychi. But the big story in Avdiivka is that the Russians are moving rapidly west of Tonenka, gaining control of the fields, the open fields west of Tonenka, and north of Pervomaisky, which is being taken into a semicircle. The Russians now control Pervomaisky from three sides. And if the pattern we have seen in other places repeats itself, what the Russians will now do is that they will use their artillery and their mortars and their drones to cut the remaining supply lines into Pervomaisky, which have now been, I suspect, reduced to one or two, and then they will then begin an attack on Pervomaisky from the part of Pervomaisky that is still under Ukrainian control from several directions. Pervomaisky will fall, and the Russians will be in control. And another important piece on the checkers board, which is the Battle of Donbass, will have fallen to the Russians. And the same, apparently, is true in the Bakhmut area as well. Again, lots of reports about more Russian advances in the Bakhmut area. The Russians advancing not just west of Ivanivska, Krasnoye as they call it, which they have captured, but apparently advancing also from the north towards Chasov Yar. Bogdanovka seems to be, well, probably is close to also falling under Russian control. And there's apparently been heavy fighting in the area around Klishevka and Andreevka, and the Ukrainians, who sense a possible collapse of their forces in the Bakhmut area, their front lines in the Bakhmut area, have apparently been trying to conduct counterattacks in the Bakhmut area towards Ivanivska. But all the reports say that those counterattacks have been unsuccessful. And there are also, by the way, reports that the Ukrainians have been obliged to redeploy units from the Zherebets River area to try to hold positions in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and even as the Russians advance, now have a Terny, the village on the Zherebets River, almost surrounded. The only place where they are not behind Terny is where the part to the west where the Zherebets River flows, but they seem to have taken Terny in a vice where they're on three sides, and it's likely that they will be able to attack and be storming Terny very soon. There's also a report this morning that the Russians are now concentrating and are preparing to launch a major offensive in the Siversk area. I saw a report on Slavyangrad that the Russians have deployed 15 equivalent, brigade equivalent units to the Siversk area. There's apparently 8 under-strength Ukrainian brigades trying to defend the area around Siversk, and, well, one way or the other, the Russians now massively outnumber the Ukrainians in Siversk. This is what is being claimed. Of course, if the Russians do take Siversk, if they mount an offensive there, then the position of the Ukrainians overall is going to weaken further still. Anyway, a very bad situation for the Ukrainians on the front lines. One can't really argue with what Putin says on this issue. He said that the Russian armed forces are maintaining the initiative along the entire front line, whilst the enemy's efforts to stabilize the front have been unsuccessful. And basically, he is right. There's a lot of tantalizing discussion also, by the way, about whether the Russians might be thinking of launching some kind of advance across the Dnieper River into the west bank of Kherson region, the area that they retreated from in the autumn of 2022. They're setting up a flotilla of warships, the Dnieper flotilla, to apparently patrol the Dnieper itself, perhaps in order to prepare for this offensive. Nobody really knows. It is the case that the Russians have been bombing and shelling Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper very intensively for months now, and we'll see what they decide to do. The Ukrainians, for their part, by the way, have been conducting strikes of their own. This morning, they claim to have damaged, perhaps even destroyed, another Russian amphibious warfare ship. Again, there's no confirmation of this claim. It is, by the way, interesting that when the Ukrainians do attack Russian warships of the Black Sea Fleet, predominantly they seem to focus on landing ships. Now, I don't think anybody has made this point before, but landing ships have proved to be a disproportionate part of the warship total that the Ukrainians claim to have attacked and in some cases sunk. And one could come up with all kinds of explanations for this, but I wonder whether one reason is perhaps the Ukrainians think that these warships, these amphibious landing ships, are relatively easy targets. They're large. Most of them date from the 1960s. They don't have strong air defenses or anti-ship defenses because they were never intended to be used in environments where there were water drones. Those didn't really exist in the 1960s. Or anti-ship missiles. Well, those did exist in the 1960s, but on nothing like the kind of scale that we see today. And as a result, these rather large warships are relatively lightly protected, whereas more modern Russian warships, the missile corvettes and the frigates, have very, very heavy air defense protection and are also, to some extent at least, capable of protecting themselves against water drones. Anyway, just saying, as of this moment in time, there is no evidence, there is no confirmation that this latest claim that the Ukrainians are making about the sinking of this amphibious warfare ship is true. Now, I only say that because the Ukrainians have made so many claims at so many times about ships they've sunk, which it turns out they haven't sunk, about aircraft that they've shot down, which it turns out they haven't shot down, that I really do reiterate again that simply because the Ukrainians make a claim like this, it is a mistake to assume it is true. Sometimes it is, but not always. Anyway, overall, as Putin says, the Russians hold the initiative. They're continuing to conduct their enormous strikes in multiple directions. Their army continues to advance in central Donbass, which is the center of operations of their army. And one senses that over the next couple of days, there will be some massive report to Putin from the heads of the investigative and intelligence services in Moscow, reporting to him on the preliminary findings about the Crocus Hill attack. And, well, we'll have to wait and see what it says. But if it says that the Ukrainians were involved in some way, then the retaliation from the Russians is going to be immense and will probably, I suspect, focus on targeting individuals in Kiev, the people who the Russians think were responsible for the attack itself. I should say that I've heard a report that the Russians have actually ordered the arrest of the director of the SBU, the man who came out this morning and said that the Ukrainians did indeed do all the bad things in Russia that the Russians have said that they did, not the Crocus Hill attack, but all the others. That this person now faces a warrant from the Russians for his arrest. We'll see whether that is true. I haven't been able to corroborate it. We'll see whether that is true and what the Russians intend to do about it. Now, I'm now going to turn to the situation in the Middle East, and I'm going to discuss this briefly, though this is a matter which perhaps deserves more attention than I'm going to give it in this program. Now, I have been saying ever since October, and especially since the military operation, Israel began its military operation in Gaza, that the diplomatic and political pressure on the United States would become, in the end, overwhelming, and we were likely to get a ceasefire resolution from the Security Council eventually. And that has now happened. A very strong, very clear Security Council resolution. And this has happened after an alternative resolution that the United States proposed failed when it was vetoed by China and Russia. Algeria then proposed its own resolution, which undoubtedly was coordinated with the BRICS states. The United States, under enormous pressure, to the dismay of Israel, abstained. And the resolution has now passed. Now, there have been many attempts to minimize the meaning of this resolution, the terms of this resolution. In fact, it is extremely strong and very clear. It says this: Resolution 2728 of 2024, adopted by the Security Council at its 9,586th meeting on 25th March 2024. The Security Council, guided by the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, recalling all of its relevant resolutions on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question, reiterating its demand that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and in this regard, deploring all attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as all violence and hostilities against civilians and all acts of terrorism, and recalling that the taking of hostages is prohibited under international law, expressing deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, acknowledging the ongoing diplomatic efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States aimed at reaching a cessation of hostilities, releasing the hostages, and increasing the provision and distribution of humanitarian aid, demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan, respected by all parties, leading to a large, sustainable ceasefire, and also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as ensuring humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs, and further demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law in relation to all persons they detain. Emphasizes the urgent need to expand the flow of humanitarian assistance to and reinforce the protection of civilians in the entire Gaza Strip, and reiterates its demand for the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance at scale in line with international humanitarian law, as well as resolutions 2712 and 2720. Decides to remain actively seized of the matter. Now, just to quickly unpack this, there is no reference to Hamas in this resolution. It is not referred to by name. This, up to now, had been a demand made by Israel, Britain, and the United States. Israel is furious about this. They are talking about the US decision to abstain on the vote for this resolution as a betrayal. There are complaints in Britain amongst some Conservative MPs that Britain supported this resolution. The fact is that whereas had a resolution been proposed in October which condemned Hamas, I have no doubt it would have passed. Months have gone by. There's been a major humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and now a resolution has passed with the United States abstaining, which does not mention Hamas. So already we see a significant retreat here. The resolution says that all parties must comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and that it deplores all attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as all violence and hostilities against civilians and all acts of terrorism, and recalling that the taking of hostages is prohibited under international law. Now, those are double edged criticisms. They criticize Hamas. Taking hostages is prohibited under international law. Attacking civilians is prohibited under international law and is terrorism. But they could be seen as criticisms of Israel also. It then says that it expresses deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. And that is clearly directed first and foremost at Israel. But then we come to the key part of the resolution. The resolution demands. Now, it's not quite the same as orders, but it is only one step below. It demands. It is, despite what some people are saying, clearly a binding resolution. It demands an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan. Immediate means now. And it says that it wants this ceasefire, this immediate ceasefire, to be succeeded by a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. The Russians were not entirely happy with that wording. They wanted the word sustainable ceasefire, lasting sustainable ceasefire, to be replaced with the word permanent ceasefire. The United States objected. The Russians waived their request. At least I believe it was put to the vote. It wasn't carried. The Russians didn't insist, didn't take it further. They in the end voted for the resolution, despite the fact that it only refers to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. The point is that we now have an immediate ceasefire, a demand for an immediate ceasefire, followed by a lasting, sustainable ceasefire. We are very close to a resolution on a permanent ceasefire. Then, and separately, it demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Now, the point here is that the demand for the release of hostages is not linked to the demand for the immediate ceasefire. The ceasefire demand is addressed, of course, to Israel. The demand for the release of hostages is addressed first and foremost to Hamas, but the one is not made a condition of the other. Now, Hamas probably will not release its hostages until the ceasefire takes place. They've taken that line all along. They're saying that they're prepared to enter into discussions as to mutual releases of people. We no doubt will be seeing all of that, and they will try to spin it out. But the Israelis have been told that the Security Council demands an immediate ceasefire. The Israelis cannot come round and say that because Hamas has not released its hostages, they're not required to implement a ceasefire. The wording of the resolution makes it clear that they are. And then we're told that there needs to be urgent flow of humanitarian assistance, and the Security Council demands, again, the lifting of all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance. And here there have been previous resolutions, and the latest resolution reminds us of all of this. Now, it is very likely that Israel will ignore this resolution. That's what they've said they will do. They're still talking about taking Rafah. They're saying that it doesn't matter if all the world, the entire world is against them, they will still do that which they consider correct for Israel's security. They will proceed with the attack on Rafah. The last part of the resolution, the very last paragraph, ought to give a warning. Now, these are standard words. This next sentence is a standard sentence that appears in many resolutions of this kind. It says that the Security Council decides to remain actively seized of the matter. That means that if there is non-compliance with the terms of this resolution, the Security Council has authorized itself to return to the topic of the resolution and decide on mechanisms for compliance. Now, in theory, that could be sanctions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which could, by the way, go all the way to authorizing military action. Now, I think that the United States will balk at any resolution directed at Israel under Chapter 7. But the pressure now is on. If Israel refuses to comply with this resolution, the matter can be taken forward by the Security Council. If the Security Council is deadlocked because the United States exercises its veto, well, the 14 countries that voted for this resolution, the BRICS groups and the Arab states, now have a clear pathway before them to take the case to the General Assembly. And, of course, all of this as the legal case against Israel at the International Court of Justice continues, with Israel being in defiance of the previous judgment of the International Court of Justice. Apparently, we are going to get a decision from the court at some point within the next few weeks. So the pressure is on, and it is intensifying, and it has intensified to the level that, as I always predicted, a Security Council resolution or a General Assembly resolution would eventually be made. We now have that ceasefire resolution from the UN Security Council. The game, the diplomatic game, cold-blooded as it must seem to many people, exasperatingly slow, is still being played. The United States, the Biden administration, is retreating and giving ground, and is losing it on its own behalf and on Israel's behalf. I now think, in light of this resolution, that a vote for a permanent resolution, a permanent ceasefire, is only a matter of time. Probably there will be such a resolution at some point over the next few weeks. And whilst, as I said, I cannot imagine the United States agreeing to sanctions against Israel under Chapter 7, I think it is highly likely that in that case, unless there is compliance from Israel, the threat for such sanctions being made by the General Assembly will start to be raised. I don't think we will get to that point, because I suspect that eventually, sooner or later, a permanent ceasefire in Gaza will indeed be in place. Now, to be very clear, when that happens, it will be seen in Israel as a defeat. Hamas is still there in Gaza. Netanyahu and his officials say that they're principally in Rafah now. That may very well be true. I'm not familiar with the situation on the ground. But as I have been saying throughout this affair, as others have been saying throughout this affair, any end to this which leaves Hamas still in existence and still maintaining a presence in Gaza amounts to a victory for Hamas. Now, I've seen this, this likely outcome. As the likely outcome right from the start, and we're now a very big step closer, finally, to that point. Well, thank you again for joining me for my program today. As I said, this is a week, another week of immense events, accelerating events. Just before I started making this program, there were reports, by the way, of a major accident at a bridge in Baltimore in the United States. I've only seen scattered and sketchy reports about what has happened. I hope that this is contained and that the casualties are not too enormous. But anyway, I'll be keeping a track of that. But in geopolitical terms, the Crocus City Hall attack, probably its consequences are only beginning. Likely, the war in Ukraine, which Ukraine is already losing, will now be escalated by the Russians further, making that Ukrainian collapse even more likely. I believe there's an article somewhere in the American media, I haven't found it, which is already saying that Ukraine is looking like a debacle like Afghanistan. And that might be an overstatement, by the way. But anyway, events around the world are moving very fast. And we see that over the Middle East crisis, the United States has lost control. The initiative has passed to the Arab states and the Muslim states and the BRICS, and that ceasefire resolution has now been passed. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing and wonderful things there. Greek Independence Day has now passed, but I think you could still find some items commemorating it on the shop if you look hard enough. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.